right at 6 o'clock. Good evening, everybody. And 6 seems to be the magic number of folks that show up. We're at 6, so it must be time to start. So thanks for coming over to Central, spending a little bit of time with us about their upcoming referendum. I'm Mark Weissman. Proud to serve as the superintendent. 7th year. Good evening, everybody. School district. And 6 is here today to talk about the upcoming referendum. We're at 6 in the high school, although I will touch a little bit on some of the other parts of the facility master plan, which does include elementary and intermediate schools. So this is not something that just kind of showed up in the last few months. There's a long story here. And so go ahead to the next one. So what we're here to do, we're going to really work hard to get in that time at high school, although I said including some of the other portions of the master. My portion of this is probably about 30 minutes. This is not split off. Again, just going to be a question. You can then individuals have more fun. So parts of the referendum and facility master plan time. Really focusing on high school questions. And then, just like I said, my portion of this have an opportunity to speak to against finance, non-construction, issues around facility. I'm here to go into every single part of the referendum and policy. And we're not here to and then, like I said, questions kind of hold until the small business finance, non-construction, big questions. I'm here to go into every single part. So, a little bit about our story of time. And we're not here to and the headline is about this taxpayers that are going to qualify for a little bit about our story of and the headline is the community here said no. So you created the mess, you figured it out. And we did. It wasn't pretty. We made some really tough decisions like freezing salaries, freezing travel. We sold the buildings, that picture there on the right, on 70th Street. We closed the school, we moved the school. And it was not easy work, but we brought it back. And we are in a strong, stable position right now financially. And that's the headline. You go back, that's the headline on the right. So 3 years, not even 3 years later, right, are experts now rating West Dallas, West Milwaukee School District's financial outlook is positive. And so what that turns into, that headline in terms of a graphic, is really about our credit rating. And so we were down in the red, it's a little hard to see in the right, junk bond status. We hit the financial mess. We actually ended up with negative $2 million in reserves for a while. That's how bad it was, and that's why our rating was so poor. We're now back up in high grade, and what that means to go out to the market to borrow money is having a high grade credit rating will save us millions of dollars in interest, right? So it's millions that get saved for the taxpayers. And that's partly why we're proposing it now while interest rates are low, and try to move forward with the high school questions. So you can go ahead. So the need. There's kind of 3 big ideas that we're trying to address. First, our schools are maintained, but they're old. Right? The oldest part of Jefferson Elementary School is 100 years old this year. Right? So if you think about it, if you followed Dan Devine at all, right, the mayor of West Dallas, on social media, during one of our cold snaps, there were water mains breaking in West Dallas. Right? And so folks were reaching out to Dan to complain about that. And one of his responses was, well, remember, some of these water mains are 50 years old, and others are 100 years old. And they're going to break and have to be replaced. And we have the same reality in our schools. Right? There's infrastructure needs that have to be addressed in old buildings. And school budgets and school funding in Wisconsin doesn't anticipate that school budgets should build buildings or do $100 million worth of infrastructure improvements. The dollars we have each year, we're supposed to use to educate the kids we have each year. All right? So big facility needs really need to be supported by communities, and that's why you hear so many school districts in Wisconsin going to referenda and having those referenda passed. So, old schools. The second big problem we're trying to address is our square footage is too large now. We have the same number of schools, buildings, and square footage back in the 70s when we had 12,000 kids. We now have 7,400. Right? So just think about the math. Now, we use school buildings differently than we did in 1974. Back then, education was thought of as every kid sits in rows and you can kind of pack kids in. We now use space differently with way more hands-on learning and projects. We use spaces more for career and tech ed. We use spaces for computer labs. So there's a lot of differences, but it's still too much square footage for the number of kids we serve. So trying to get right sizing the number of schools. And then, like I said, our current facilities don't support modern learning. The opportunities that that teachers have get limited by the physical space they're in. If you walk through any modern schools, like some of our surrounding suburban neighbors have when they've passed referenda and we're able to do upgrades, the space looks and feels very different. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a remodeled high school in the area that has a cafeteria like this with no windows, right? It feels to me whenever I walk in here, it's like, why don't we keep the kids in the basement for lunch? We're not actually in the basement. If you went to the basement, it's scary. But it feels like that when you walk in here. So those are the three big challenges or needs. So I'm going to walk through some of the kind of big questions. So what are we pursuing with this referendum? What's included? What will it accomplish? What will it cost me? Right, which is always a big question. And then what happens if it fails? It's important for us to really be honest and clear about it. So I've touched on some of these already. The average age of our buildings is 76, over 76 years across the district. Right? The newest part of any building is at Lane. Right? So when the district bought that property back, the previous school provider had put an addition on it. Right? So that's the new gym and some classroom spaces. But the older part, there's kind of like three sections of it. The oldest part is not very useful for us, and we can't actually use the basement at Lane for educational purposes because heating and ventilation is not up to code for educational purposes. So it's kind of just a big storage space and a place that they have to make sure kids don't wander into all the time. Enrollment declines, right? So I said we're at 7,400. We did a big study. Roffers was brought in, and we launched the Facility Advisory Community Team. So that started in January of 2020. So that's how far back all this planning goes. And the community team, there's 40 members, community members, some staff, retirees, the mayor was on it, a representative from West Milwaukee was on it. And they started to really work through and understand the dynamics of there's just fewer kids and there are more educational options. And so our projection is we'll go to about 7,000 kids in total enrollment over time. And when you just do the numbers of how many kids are in high school, so our graduating classes now, if you combine Central, Hale, and Docky, we're about 650 kids in a class. What's coming in, that's across 3 schools. Right. Well, wait. What's coming behind the 650 are classes in the 400s. So 450, 480. So if you just do the math, right, having 2 large comprehensive high schools, the heat, cool, maintain, offer courses, it just doesn't work out going forward. So the analysis that FACT received from engineers and architects, if you're curious about it, it's all on our website. So if you go to the website, up on the right-hand side, there's a tab referendum, which is really this information. If you scroll down, there's a tile named facility planning. And inside of that is every presentation, every document FACT received. If you really want to go deep in this, there's a report there of over 600 pages that details out every single thing that needs to be fixed, replaced, when it has to happen in every single building, right? So we know which blower motor, we know which valve, we know, and that's where the numbers start to add up for the infrastructure needs in the buildings. So what's included? This would be the merger of the two comprehensive high schools. So we're proposing that Central and Hale would merge as one school, and because numbers support it, right? So it'll be a school of 16 to 1,800 as it kind of evolves over time a little bit. It would repurpose and remodel the current Nathan Hale site. And I'll get into it a little bit later in the presentation slide on why Nathan Hale and not Central. But it would repurpose Nathan Hale as a new modern high school. Now Nathan Hale is big enough, so we need to do some additions, and we need to recreate it for modern learning. So it's really a redesign and a rethink of how the high school is organized. But what we're really excited about, the second bullet here, is an expanding partnership with MATC. And so in the background, we work with MATC in a lot of efforts. But we'd really like to grow two big opportunities. One is first around career and tech ed, so the trades. So how do we prepare young people to go into the trades to find that appealing? We believe having better spaces, better shops, actually helps us fulfill that, or attract kids into the trades and educate them. We can create the space if the referendum is approved, and MATC will pay to put all the equipment into those classrooms. Those are very expensive classrooms to equip. There's a little video coming up on what is right down the hall here, about why our current CTE spaces are problematic. But they're expensive classrooms to equip, and in exchange, we're going to share the spaces. So we'll use the MATC shared spaces during the normal school day, school year, and MATC will use it to educate college students, nights, weekends, and summer, right? And so instead of asking, we're both taxing entities, right? We could both go to taxpayers. Instead of duplicating all of this equipment, it gets paid for once, and it gets shared. So that's one part of the partnership with MATC. The other one is, go stay on that side, thanks, is expanding dual enrollment opportunities. And what we're working through is course pathways that lead into careers. That student, starting in 9th grade, if they really know, like, I want to go into the trades, I want to go into construction, we can build a pathway for that young person to actually finish a high school diploma and an associate's degree in 4 years. So it's possible for young people to graduate high school and have a college degree at the same time. And it will all be done because of the partnership with MATC. So that's a piece that, if the promise of a referendum is fulfilled, that we can really pursue. So this Autolift example, there's not really sound with this, it just kind of pans the room. So this is in Central High School. That's the shop. You can see it's tight, but look at the red columns, right? Those are the supports of the lift system. So like in your mechanic, they lift up the car to work underneath it. But if you look at the top, they go up through the ceiling tiles. You can't actually raise the car here in the shop to the standard height to work under it, because the car would go through the ceiling. So the kids are learning to work on cars here, but it's not really at the industry expectation of what they'll experience when they go out into the real world. I've shared this, and somebody said, well, just tear out the ceiling tiles. Well, above the ceiling tiles are electrical lines and plumbing lines and data lines, and so it's not as simple as just tear the ceiling tiles out. And so that's why better CTE spaces are really a part of the vision for the new high school. So go ahead. So next big question, what will this accomplish? So it will align enrollment with capacity, and I've already talked about that. It'll amplify other educational opportunities as well. So part of what we're challenged by with two high schools right now, and with smaller classes coming through, is that there are times when students get really excited, they sign up for specialty courses, they sign up for advanced or honors courses, and there might be 6 here at Central and 4 up further up on Lincoln at Hale. And then those kids get a call from the counselor in August that says, sorry, not enough kids signed up for that class, we're going to have to cancel it. Because it's not fiscally responsible to run a course and put a teacher in there for 4 kids. Now, if the schedules work, we run vans up and down Lincoln, so we move kids. But the schedule doesn't always work, and so we cancel classes. So having more kids in one place that find those kind of classes interesting, we're more likely to be able to run those courses each school year. Then the other piece that this would achieve is annual operating savings of $2.5 to $3 million. And that's a little bit of why, starting with the high school, with the facility master plan, is that it achieves the maximum operational efficiency compared to the elementary and middles, and more quickly. And so that really comes from reducing overhead and reducing overall square footage. Right now, between this building and Hale, we actually have 100,000 more square feet for high school students than we actually need. It's unfortunate that they're two different places, but that's 2 football fields worth of space, right? That has to get heated and cooled and cleaned and maintained, right? So the overall high school footprint shrinks, even though we have to put additions on Hale to make that happen in one place. The operational savings, before we do that one, come from overhead that also gets reduced, right? So it's really the administrative overhead that gets reduced, because right now we have 2 principals, well, we only need 1, right? We have 4 assistant principals, we probably need 3. We have 2 SROs, we probably need 1. We have 2 head custodians, we need 1. We have 2 head psych, right? So that part of the cost comes down. We'll still need the same number of teachers per student, right? So that's really a staffing ratio, so that doesn't really change. We'll staff the buildings the same way, but the overhead positions, we can eliminate. We need fewer of that. The other big thing that this will accomplish, and we think this maybe is interesting to people, is that it's an opportunity to bring the entire community together at one point for a student's educational career here in West Allis, West Milwaukee. And for generations, right, this has been an east versus west kind of dynamic in the community. 2 high schools, even though they're only a few miles apart, and it feeds into that. And maybe this is a moment where, at least for the high school experience, we can bring people together, cheer on all the athletes in one place, clap for all the performers, go see all the artwork in one place to bring the community together. So the enrollment versus capacity piece, here's a graphic way of looking at that. The yellow line is our total enrollment, right? So that's all the students that are enrolled. The orange or red line is resident enrollment, right? So those are kids that live here that go to school here. On top of that are students that come here from other places. So if they come from other school districts, so that we call open enrollment, right? And the blue, the dark blue above it, that's all excess capacity, right? So one of the questions that has come up is, well, what if resident enrollment turns around because there's more young people moving into West Allis, and there's really kind of cool development starting to happen. So what if they stay and start having more kids, and then we don't have enough room because you got rid of a high school? Well, if you just look at the gap between the red line and the yellow line, we can manage the number of students that come in through open enrollment. So if we have more resident students, that red line can actually work its way up if we don't bring as many students in through open enrollment, right? So it's kind of anticipated that maybe that would happen, and that would be a great problem to have. If we have more resident students, it would be wonderful for us. So what will it cost, right? So if this is approved, right, it would be a tax increase for property taxpayers, so the portion of the property taxes that are driven by the school district will go up. It's $119 per year for every $100,000 of value. So a home that's worth $100,000, it's $119 a year. That's under $10 a month, right? At a $300,000 home, we're just under $30 a month, right? So you can go to the next slide. That's where that one is. So that gives you a little sense of, the investment we're asking the community to make. When we talk about it, it's $150 million or it's $149,800,000. 150 million practically. That sounds like such an enormous number, and it gets to be a little bit overwhelming to think of it. But when you start to break it down on kind of what's the investment per month to be able to give this community a brand new high school that becomes a point of pride. And if you visited any of the new high schools or remodeled high schools in the area, we're kind of the last school district, except for Milwaukee, that hasn't really reinvested in its school buildings. And they really do become places that people are really proud of. They're cool to walk into modern high schools and experience those spaces. I live just on the edge of Wauwatosa, and what they did to East and put in a fancy aquatic center, and every time I drive, I was like, I have to drive by here at night so I can see what it looks like inside. It is beautiful. And so when you break it down like that, hoping people can kind of go, okay, maybe that is worth investing in the high school idea to create a modern building that we can all be really proud of, that brings everybody together. So in terms of a graphic around the tax impact, and we think this is powerful as well, and this speaks to some of the managing we've been doing on, and so the mill rate has been coming down, 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 right? But even adding that $1.19 for every $1,000 of value, or $119 for $100,000, the overall mill rate for the school's portion of property taxes will still be less than it was 2 years ago, and we went back further, it's less than any other year except 2021, going back all the way to 2009. And so even though it's a tax increase, property owners here have been paying much higher taxes and not getting into high school out of it, right? And so we think it's a powerful way to look at, okay, what are we really asking the community to commit to here? Go ahead. So what happens if it fails? And this one is always a little bit kind of delicate because it doesn't want to. We don't want to sound like it's threatening or twisting arms, but at the same time, we should be really honest. Because the reality of old schools means we're going to have to start fixing these systems, and that money has to come from somewhere, right? It's going to come from somewhere else in the budget. I was at Key last week. I did the presentation. It was for the staff. The custodian was in the room. He lives in West Dallas, and afterwards, he's a guy that likes to talk. So I need to spend a little time with him when we talk. And we're right in where you first walk in Key, so that's the old Lincoln. And he said, well, Marty, right behind this wall, there's a hot water line that doesn't work anymore, and we can't fix it. And I said, why not? He said, well, we have to tear out the walls on the first, second, and third floor to do it, and that's not built in the budget right now. And so there's sinks on the second and third floor that don't have hot water. Because at some point, you have to start tearing open the walls to fix these systems. The other example I use, I think this is pretty accurate, that it would be absolutely unacceptable to everyone in this room, to this entire community, if fire safety and suppression systems in schools fail. Right? But those systems don't last forever. And at some point, there's part of it right there, the little red boxes on the walls. At some point, you have to start opening up the walls and replacing those systems. And so the total cost of infrastructure needs just across the two high schools is over $60 million. Now that's plumbing systems, electrical systems, heating, ventilation systems, it's all the safety security systems. All of those pieces in aging buildings eventually don't work anymore, right? And so there's a point at which we have to start addressing it, and it's going to mean we go to the large, when you're trying to figure out where you can take dollars from a budget, the first place you look is where you spend the most money in a budget, right? And we spend the most money in programs and class size. Keeping class sizes lower, and you can generate quite a bit of dollars by increasing class sizes and cutting programs and reinvesting that into the infrastructure needs. So that's something that we would have to start to face. We wouldn't be able to renovate spaces for modern learning, so creating the kind of learning experiences for young people. The design of the high school, and if you're curious about that, you can sit with the architects and the engineers in a few minutes, is different than at least the high school I went to and the high school I taught at. They were designed around content. They were designed, and even this building, all the math teachers are kind of together, and then all the English teachers, and I was a social studies teacher, and we had our hallway. The modern high schools aren't designed around content, they're designed around teaching and learning. They're designed around teachers and kids. And putting kids and teachers together in learning communities. So there might be 8, 10 teachers, all the core, kind of math, science, social studies, English, that would be housed together, and then the students have an experience of a big high school but a smaller learning community. So you can have both an efficient operation by getting big, but an experience of relationships that are small. Like you get to know your learning community. And learning communities in modern high school can also have career themes. So we could have a biomedical community, we can have an IT community. So they start to have some specialties. And each community in the design and the floor plan in the brochure has worked into it, well, now we call them maker spaces, but essentially it is kind of a shop or flexible space so that teachers can engage kids with hands-on, not have all the mess in classrooms, and share those kind of spaces. So it's a different way of organizing the physical space. And we wouldn't be able to renovate to bring that kind of opportunity in. We wouldn't be able to leverage the MATC funding. We continue to struggle to offer competitive athletics. And a lot of teams, athletic teams were already co-opted, but last fall, right here, there weren't enough students for a varsity football team. Now it looks better for next fall because the new principal here, Dr. Reed, is very committed to athletics and getting kids engaged in all the after-school clubs and activities. So I asked him, he said, yeah, I think we got a team for next fall. But that's going to be a year by year unless we combine. And then our students will continue to be educated in old facilities compared to neighbors, right? So it's an opportunity, I think, for us to have families or have young people that start to move here because there's interesting apartments and there's new restaurants. And if they want to start families, to stay here, find a house and buy a house and be attracted to the fact that, oh, they have cool school buildings. They're investing in education. So the high school consolidation plan, so again, assuming it passes, and if it does pass, that would be great. If it doesn't pass, that's okay. It's not going to be considered a defeat. It's going to be considered feedback. Because this is a 20-year plan to address all of the buildings, and so we're going to find a different place to start. And eventually, we believe the community will support it if it's not the high school the first time around. The high school problems or challenges won't go away. But it makes sense to start at the high school. Every student eventually goes to the high school, and that's where we get the best operational savings. So why Nathan Hale? In fact, Facility Advisory Community Team, we did do an analysis of this building. Could this building work? If you're going to go to one high school and a community or school district that's 11 miles long, well, where you'd like to have it is right in the middle, right? Centrally located. But this building and the amount of land around it just doesn't allow for it. It is more expensive to renovate this building into a building large enough for all of the students and modern spaces. The oldest part of this building are much older than Hale. Hale's a much more sound building, although it's aging as well. And if we were to build it here, we'd have to put a parking structure in across the street, staff and students, and then the athletic fields would still be down on 117th Street. Plus we start buying houses, and then it's way more expensive to keep it here. So it's just not viable as a solution, and there aren't pieces of land available. I did have a conversation with John Stulewski over at West Milwaukee, and I said, well, Komatsu's going to leave, and they have their new factory. That's big enough for a new high school. Give me that land. And he just smiled, right? Because, of course, municipalities want property on tax rolls, not coming off tax rolls, right? So this is just not a viable place. But part of the criticism of the plan of repurposing Nathan Hale and creating a modern high school there is a piece about equity. That it's not fair that students that live on the east side of the school district now have to ride a bus to get to their high school all the way out at the Hale site. Well, it's about 3 miles more than getting to Central, so it's not that much more of a ride. But our commitment is that no student will ride a bus longer than they currently ride today. Right? So we won't add transportation time, we're going to add transportation cost. So we're going to take about $500,000, it's actually $530,000 of this operational savings and reinvest it in the student experience. So put it back into transportation so that no student has a longer bus ride. And we're going to invest some of that $530,000 in after-school transportation. So the idea is there would be 2 rounds of transportation after school. So for clubs and activities, that would get done about 4 o'clock. Students get picked up, out at the Nathan Hale site, and then get dropped off at their nearest elementary school. And then you run another round at 6 o'clock for athletes, right? So that it actually improves the student experience compared to what they have right now. The consolidation, again, if this is successful, would begin with the 23-24 school year. So it takes 12 months plus in planning to get from kind of the concept to construction drawings, to shovels in the ground. And it would be implemented in phases. So different parts of the building would go under construction at different times. And we would need to relocate students from Hale to Central for a while. So actually having this great big building here helps in the transition. to allow us to have an operating school under construction at the same time. But it also does something I think would be really unique, because all ninth graders at first year 23, 24 come to this building. They're the start of the new school. They're also the first graduating class of the new school. Right now they're in 7th grade. Okay? So I'm going to talk to all of them, all the kids in intermediate schools in the next couple weeks. But that idea of them all coming together, they become friends now because they're all ninth graders together, starting high school all together. And they get to start the traditions of what's the school name going to be, what's the mascot going to be, what are the colors going to be, what's the school song going to be. So there's a lot of opportunity to get people excited, and especially students excited, about the new school. And so this would take place probably over 3 to 4 years to do the entire transition. There's a point at which then the first graduating class, all of those students are here for a couple of years. We pick them all up and move them to the new modern school to be named later at some point. So, yeah, you can go ahead. So a little bit on elementary and intermediate. And so this is a different part of the facility master plan. The consolidation of intermediates, when I talk through it, it just starts to make sense that obviously it would be lane that we would not continue to run. We're committed to keeping the schools in the various communities that we serve. So we have 2 schools in West Milwaukee, West Milwaukee Intermediate, Pershing. We're committed to keeping those schools. And we're committed to keeping Hoover, which is a new borough. Right, so if we're keeping West Milwaukee Intermediate, then when you look at Lane versus FLW is a much better building. Right? The old part of Lane is not very functional for us. And it has very little land around it. If you think of FLW, it's a newer building with a nice piece of property, although FLW, to be a modern school, is going to take quite a bit of heavy renovation, so that's a different part of the plan. If you've been in FLW, it has very few windows in it. And that was a time when designers of educational facilities thought natural light wasn't as important. And now we know differently about the power of natural light and the influence it has on learning. And so that would be the intermediate part of it. The elementary part of it, there's still a number of decisions to be made. There is a consolidation team that's been working. There's a couple board members on it. I'm on it. Steve Eichmann, who's in charge of our facilities, is on it. Caitlin, who's in charge of our finance and operations, is on that team. And we're looking at 25 criteria to determine which buildings make the most sense to keep and which ones should we consolidate with others. We could go from 11 to 9 or even to 8 elementary school buildings at some point in the future. So, but again, that's a little bit further down the road, and the plan is that we bring the recommendations from this process to the school board in May, June. So after this particular referendum question voted on. And then we're ready for some small group discussion. So I'm right at my 32 minutes. And so what we like to do with this is that if there's part of this plan that you're really interested in, that you have an opportunity to sit with kind of an expert in that part of the plan. And so over there is Steve Eichmann. So Steve, raise your hand. So he's our manager of facilities. So if you're curious about just the condition of facilities, the infrastructure, why do we spend right now on trying to fix roofs and doors and windows? That's all questions for Steve. And next to him is Deidre Raymer. She's our Director of Leadership and Learning. So I kept saying modern high school, modern learning spaces. So if you're curious more, what does that really mean? What kind of learning are you doing? That's a conversation to have with Deidre. If you're curious about building design and construction management and those kind of pieces, Mark and Matt are here. So from Bray and C.G. Schmidt. So they're on this journey with us. So like I talked about, the modern design of high schools, so that's a set of questions for them. And if you're curious about the cost and the financing and our budgets and all of those kind of pieces, that's a conversation for Caitlin, and we have our financial advisor here from Barrett as well to help kind of work through some of those questions. So we'll go till about 7 o'clock, right? We want to honor kind of what we've asked, but you don't have to stay till 7 if your questions are answered now. Or if you want to sit with somebody, we've got about 25 minutes. So move around a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, you're all good. Making room for all the masses of people that are coming over to see us.
Does that have a hard?
It's 25 years. Yes. Correct. And we